This is the Fifth Estate winning headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you might have missed this morning. But we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 26th of May, 2020, and I am 2J.
I am JM.
And I am GK, and in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, NASA angles for Jubilee spoils. In the Standard, why Ruto is feared. And in the Star, broken vows. All short and sweet today.
Yes.
May we begin with the Standard?
Why is Ruto feared?
So according to the Standard newspaper, Ruto's vindictive and authoritarian tendencies are partly what is fueling the political onslaught against him. The newspaper says his critics have painted him as an over-ambitious politician obsessed with his presidential bid, overly abrasive and likely to use his powers to crush his opponents should he become president in 2022. His allies, on the other hand, believe the ongoing onslaught, including his being labelled corrupt, is part of political machinations by powerful forces to slow down his popularity. Additionally, it reports that Kieni MP Kanini Kega yesterday accused Ruto's allies of trying to whip up the public's emotions with narratives of a political witch hunt regarding the impeachment motion that has been crafted for the National Assembly for the 2nd of June against him.
All right.
So yes.
But does the headline, or rather, does the story actually tell us why he's feared? Because
he's feared because he is authoritarian and because he is vindictive.
Yeah.
I think there are other things that might, indicate towards what that fear, where that fear may come from.
Yeah.
And I think that the Standard should have just come out and said it. I think there's a lot of stuff that has been happening online on social media, lots of conversations going on. And to say that it's just purely about his obsession with the presidency, to me, doesn't amount to fear. Yeah.
Interesting. And I think, we've seen recent events where, for instance, the food donations have had issues, things like that. I think there's a lot of conversation that has been happening with his candidacy for 2022.
Yes.
There's this ultimatum question, if you do not vote for Ruto, that there will be violence, there will be civil war in 2022. Is this fair? Is this democracy? Should we be voting out of fear? And I think the Standard is rightly asking those questions. And I think Kenyans should ask themselves, is Ruto going to be the solution to your problems in 2022? All the problems you're undergoing now, is he the solution to them? And I think it's fair to put those into the public conversation.
Yes, definitely.
Well, we have a 3-part criteria that we use to break down the headlines. We ask ourselves, is it topical or speculative? Is it repetitive or groundbreaking? And is it thoughtful or just plain lazy? Is the fear founded? Should we be scared?
No, we shouldn't be scared. As we've seen in the last 2-3 weeks, he has been deflated. He is a slow-punctured politician right now.
The Hustler Nation may beg to differ.
That's also
he has built this image over the past few years, knowing he will be the candidate.
The Hustler Nation is condemned to being and to living in disorganization, to being disorganized. They are chaotic aggregate.
However, I think it's a good headline.
Good headline? Shall we park it for now?
Park it.
Let's move to the Daily Nation, where they're saying NASA angles for Jubilee spoiled. So basically, this is the season of parliamentary group meetings after, there being quite a hiatus on these things. And so it starts with ODM this Thursday. They're putting their house in order. And they hope to also organize its NASA affiliates who had signed the pre-2017 election pact. And Jubilee is also set to hold theirs on the 2nd of June, ahead of the resumption of House business. So basically, Parliament is to resume. And so basically, there's 3 agendas. There's the budget estimates that are to be read by Ukur Yatani, the CS for Treasury, and that will be read on June 11th. There's the BBI report, and there's reorganization of House committees. So why they're saying NASA is angling for Jubilee spoils is that in this reorganization, NASA hopes to get some of these House committee positions. And again, the idea, like we've been saying for the past few weeks, is to clear any obstacles to the path to the things that the president wishes to implement, whether it's BBI, or impeachment or whatever.
And it is his right, it is his presidency.
Exactly.
Not a co-presidency.
His
between him and
presidency.
Ruto. Yeah.
And so Senate apparently was offered about 1 billion shillings for oversight fund, with a request to help the president with 2 assignments. One, not specified, save for the hint that one would be a political item. And we can probably guess that will be... okay, no, let me not guess. But the legacy item might be BBI. If we institute this governance change, then that could be it. So and parliamentary group meetings historically have been tools of influence. And ways to get what you want done, and you can control the outcome on vital issues. So it's high time it's happening.
So the Star covers much of the same thing, but I will say that I'd call the Star a skinnier version of the Daily Nation. It's not as fleshed out as the Daily Nation was. I think it's a good headline, but a lot of the information is not new. So they talk about how before the parliamentary group meeting on Tuesday next week, first will be the National Management Committee meeting that's supposed to take place on Thursday at State House.
For Jubilee.
For Jubilee, yes. And so they mention here how last week Ruto lost the case before the Political Parties Dispute Tribunal, and that Tujo has confirmed that Jubilee is indeed getting their house in order. But then on the other hand, you have the DP-affiliated allies in Jubilee who are saying that they will not allow themselves to be left out of the meeting, and that if it means camping outside of State House at 6 in the morning, they will be there to ensure that they don't get sidelined again. So I think they're realizing that things are happening and they really are being left behind. So good luck.
They're not in the WhatsApp group that is influencing these things.
JM was suggesting that maybe these DP allies should stand in front of Gate A with,
with pickets and say, please let us in, let us in. We're on our knees, forgive us. Sorry for being such.
So guys, who do we give our winning headline? Is it between the Standard, the Daily Nation, or the Star?
I would give it to the Standard. Why Ruto is feared. Yeah, I think it's a good headline. Snappy.
Standard.
Standard gives us our winning headline. Onto the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a 3-part criteria. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy?
Yes.
So if we begin with the Daily Nation, and here we have a caricature of Atwoli, Kotu Secretary, with a bow and arrow. But the bow and arrow has like a plastic suction cup, not an actual one to injure you. And then you have a huge, larger-than-life caricature of DP William Ruto. And in his back pocket is Aden Duale, with his caricature, with his big ears, signature big ears. And it says, Duale must go. But it seems that Atwoli is hitting all the arrows and missing the back
him.
pocket.
The funny thing for me here is Duale is conspicuously
huge ears.
Huge ears.
Which you can't miss.
You can't miss.
But also what's confusing, is this supposed to be like a Cupid metaphor kind of thing? Does Atwoli want Duale to love him? I don't know what the...
And Duale has been questioning Atwoli, who are you acting for? You're not part of a parliamentary group or anything like that. So, and he says that his record speaks for itself. So he should not be removed as majority leader. Let's move to the Standard.
So in the Standard, Gasso has adopted the scene from the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so here we have a caricature of former Deputy Speaker of the Senate, Kithure Kindiki, standing before the Senate, where he has been presented for trial and crucifixion. On the Senate floor is the Speaker, Kenneth Lusaka, depicted as Pontius Pilate, washing his hands, saying, I find no fault in this man. And in the audience are our Pharisees, that is Majority Whip, perhaps, Kangata and Orengo and company. And on the other side are the multitudes baying for his blood, saying, crucify him. Crucify him.
I thought this was so funny.
It's a fantastic cartoon.
Funny cartoon.
Very well layered.
Very appropriate. Is a metaphor or what?
I like it.
It's fantastic.
Shall we park it?
Yes, park it, definitely.
All right, then in the Star, this I giggled a little bit. We have caricatures of Atwoli, Uhuru Kenyatta, Ruto, and Aden Duale. And you have Aden Duale straddling Ruto. But he's also then trying to hug Uhuru Kenyatta. And all the while, his long tongue is slithering out and hissing at Atwoli. And in the caption, it's Duale carriage, like dual carriage.
Guys.
I'm not a fan.
I absolutely loved it.
You know how I feel about Ozone and his use of word. I don't even know what
It's
to
like
call
a double entendre.
I don't even know, is it a
loved
pun? Is it, I don't know what to call it.
I really liked it because all the while he's trying to secure his position
Yeah.
in the party and as the majority speaker, and then you have him also holding on to DP and saying,
And
you know, we
DP
can
holding
still be
on to
friends.
him.
Yes.
And it's actually this cartoon, and I think the one from the Daily Nation kind of makes me think, for how long are these so-called DP allied MPs or people going to actually stay on his side? I feel like if you start seeing that the grass is burning on one end, you may want to shift over to the other side.
The other side.
So maybe this cartoon is also foretelling.
You guys looked like you liked the standard cartoon better.
I did.
Okay, so
Personally.
we give it a vote between standard and the star.
GK, I'm going to give it to you because you giggled so much.
Thank you. There
I
we
think,
go.
yeah. as much as
So
it
the
hurts
star.
me.
The star gives us our winning cartoon. And what is our final thought?
And now our final thought. In continuation, as we look at Martin Meredith's The State of Africa in the lead up to Madaraka Day next week, Monday. So today we're going to move over to part 2 of the book, and I will start looking at chapter 9, The First Dance of Freedom. So I think that this book it's very interesting, and it has a very blunt portrayal of some of the characters of the early African liberation movements. And Meredith does a really good job of recounting the subsequent downfall of a lot of Africa's early heroes as they assume political power. So this chapter in specific focuses on the role of African leaders whose characters and careers had an impact on the fate of their countries, as we all know. It examines also, very importantly, the reasons why, after this euphoria of the independence era, so many of the hopes and ambitions that these leaders set out kind of failed, and why the future of Africa came to be spoken with such pessimism. And I'll just read something that he says in this chapter. In one country after another, African leaders acted in contempt of constitutional rules and agreements that they had sworn to uphold to enhance their own power. Constitutions were either amended or rewritten or simply ignored. Checks and balances were removed. And I think this is something that we all know to be true of the continent at that time. So there were many arguments to justify why one-party systems were to be followed. New states were facing so many challenges that it was argued that they needed strong governments, which were best served by concentrating authority under one national single party. And so in some of the cases, these pre-independence elections, for example, in Francophone Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Mali, and Tunisia, they had one-party systems which were achieved through popular verdict. The people actually wanted it. And then in other cases, you have one-party systems which were arranged by negotiation, where opposition parties were asked to cross over, to join together. And I think this is just an example of elite consensus. And so the argument was that multi-party politics would usually deteriorate into a competition between tribes or coalitions, since opposition parties used to rely on tribal groups for their support base. And this was argued to be a luxury that these African countries could not afford, as they were just new flourishing independent states. So you have these ambitious plans that were launched, bright young men who walk and climb very quickly to the top with high expectations. But I feel like these stories reflect good intentions but bad actions. So when he writes about Kwame Nkrumah, for example, who he says believed himself to possess unique ability capable of achieving for Africa what Marx and Lenin had achieved for Europe and what Mao had achieved for China. So he created this official ideology called Nkrumahism, and he built this institute that cost millions of dollars. But despite the efforts, nobody actually knew what Nkrumahism meant. And every year they would change the slogan or the basis for what it represented. By the end of it, it was a shell of nothing. And then he compares it again to Guinea, who you have Sekou Touré, who created himself in the same fashion. And his main title was to be known as the Great Son of Africa. He was also known as the terror of international imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. And he was known as a doctor of revolutionary sciences. So he portrayed himself as an expert in every field, from football to philosophy to agriculture to cooking. And yet you have these leaders spitting out these grand ideals for which they want to lead their country, and nothing ever comes of it. So I think the title is apt, The First Dance of Freedom. You have these leaders approaching the dance floor and not really knowing how to move, how to navigate.
And mastering nothing in the end.
Exactly.
So in chapter 8, the one before this, he speaks of the birth of nations. And here he talks about how Africa may have really had this false decolonization, leaving real power, like you're saying, in the hands of foreigners and these agents among the ruling elite. So elite consensus is formed, but no real actual change at the bottom. And he argues that perhaps what was then needed again is still this revolution, this war, this violence to have a transformation, an overhaul of the system. And he says that there was an interesting phenomenon of foreign interest in Africa, a newly independent Africa. So you had China, and China, because they didn't have the resources that the British and the Americans had, they focused on dissident groups such as Sawaba movement in Niger, the Tutsi exiles in Burundi, and the opposition groups in Kenya. And they tried to impose this communist ideology in these groups. And when China's premier Zhou Enlai made his tour of African states in December 1963 to February 1964, he said, Africa is ripe for revolution. And so another foreign player that was keen to find a revolutionary role in Africa was actually Cuba. So Fidel Castro decided in 1965 to dispatch an expeditionary force to Eastern Congo to assist rebel groups operating there. And the idea was to overthrow the Shombe government. So before, they've gotten independence in 1961 through Lumumba, and there's been a series of just tumultuous times for this newly independent country. So he sends this Cuban army, which he was calling the International Proletarian Army, an alliance of revolutionary groups that were aimed at confronting American imperialism around the world. So 120 Cuban fighters come. They are led by none other than Ernesto Che Guevara. And he had become bored. He didn't want to be a minister anymore. So he really looked forward to coming to the Congo. So much so that he said, I shall go to the Congo. This is now Guevara telling Abdel Nasser, because it is the hottest spot in the world right now. I think we can hurt the imperialists at the core of their interest in Katanga. And so during his 6 months in Africa, Che kept a diary. And this is what was so interesting. He would write about dysentery, about his asthma, but along with he wrote his assessment of Kabila, Laurent Kabila. And it was about 150 pages that went unpublished, which was now newly published. And he really wrote about Kabila and how Kabila was unwilling to show his face at the front, fighting with the masses. He just wouldn't. And so he would spend his time in Cairo, Dar es Salaam, and Paris, in the best hotels, issuing communiques and drinking scotch in the company of beautiful women.
Armchair general.
And when in Kigoma, now Tanzania, Kabila moved from saloon to whorehouse. He was very blank about it. And Kabila also refused Che to join his troops in the front line, because Kabila was like, my troops are not going to understand why an Argentinian is coming to fight at the forefront and lead while he was whining and dining. So this is a quote that Che put in his diary, which I want to read to you very quickly. Every day it was the same old story. Kabila did not arrive today, but he will be here tomorrow. And if not, then the day after tomorrow. Kabila has not set foot since time immemorial at the front. Nothing leads me to believe that Kabila is the man of the hour. If someone were to ask me whether there's an individual in the Congo who would become a national figure, I could not answer affirmatively. The only man who has the potential to be a mass leader is Kabila, a totally pure revolutionary. If he does not have leadership skills, cannot lead a revolution, but a man with leadership skills does not become ipso facto a revolutionary leader. And he was essentially saying, yes, you have the ability to be a mass leader, but you have to have that sacrifice, that spirit, that ideology in which to become a revolutionary leader. And so what was interesting, Mobutu would then take power at the end of that year in 1965. And Che would soon head home and die about 2 years later. So the journal shows that his African adventure into the Congo was a total failure. And they're sort of highlighting that, revolution cannot be done from outside with other people. It has to be by the Congolese themselves. So Mobutu takes power, and Laurent Kabila takes power 30 years later. So Che wasn't so wrong, but it just took longer. It worked out in the end.
And so the death of an emperor is one of the very memorable stories told. And this is the death of Emperor Haile Selassie. And so the author tells us that no other African leader during the independence era was revered as widely as Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. And that's because of his defiant and successful stand against Mussolini's brutal invasion in the 1930s. He was a symbol of an independent African nationalist, and these are the leaders that our own leaders wanted to emulate and to become. And so in Africa, he was regarded as an elder statesman. In Jamaica, fun fact, he was worshipped as a living god, in brackets Jah, by adherents of Rastafarianism, we're told, a religion that emerged in the 1930s and took its name from Haile Selassie's original title, Rastafari, during a 3-day visit that he made to Jamaica in 1966. So he ruled Ethiopia from 1916, first as regent, then as emperor, beginning 1930. And he was quite an impressive leader by way of track record. He built roads, he abolished slavery, he built lots of schools, hospitals, railway to the Red Sea, we are told. But towards the late 1960s and early 70s, his regime was beginning to crumble. And so, and additionally, he was also becoming quite senile as he grew older. By the year 1970, he had turned about 80 years old. So Haile Selassie, we are told, for the longest time, had created and maintained a perfect patronage system where advancements in government, appointments, dismissals were made based purely on loyalty. And he was the absolute monarch, absolute ruler. He dished out lands, dished out money from the government, and so on and so forth. And that particularly wasn't conducive for the country that Ethiopia was becoming. It wasn't compatible. And a few other examples, the PM answered to him and not Parliament. At the same time, the army was also going broke. They weren't being paid very, very well. His succession was also in crisis because as he was growing older, he needed somebody to succeed him, but his sons either died or fell ill. And, basically the regime began to crumble. And his ministers, who could have saved him, who could have saved this archaic system of government, were too afraid of displeasing him. And so the author says they took no initiative and they allowed the government to drift indeterminately. And so in the year 1973, everything that could go wrong went wrong. There was a huge famine in the country. He and his government were not very responsive to it. And then in 1974, mutinies in the army began. And every mutiny that took, a series of mutinies took place, and Haile Selassie would subsequently give concessions to the soldiers. And emboldened by that sign of weakness, the soldiers decided to form a military committee known as the Derg that comprised about 108 representatives of the armed forces. And so the Derg, in a few months in 1974, grew in stature, they grew in power, and finally in September, they voted to dethrone Haile Selassie. He was taken prisoner in one of their barracks and subsequently the Grand Palace, which is where he died as a prisoner in August 1975 on the day of the 27th. And his cause of death, we are told, was circulatory failure. Meanwhile, a major known as Mengistu Haile Mariam, junior officer during that era, during those turbulent months, was beginning to attain clout and rise up into senior positions in the army, and eventually he took over as leader of Ethiopia. So this was a particularly dark moment, I would think, for people like Jomo Kenyatta and for some of those independence leaders who had really looked up to Haile Selassie during the colonial period and drew inspiration from him.
Fantastic. So on a day where we had a winning headline from the Standard.
Are you tossing your headlines?
I am. And a winning cartoon from the Star. I want to leave.
I'm tossing. Violently.
I want to leave you with this. The fight for independence is really teaching us one thing, and it's a quote from Che Guevara. If I lose, it will not mean that it was impossible to win. So we must always keep fighting for what we believe in. Even as those around us stumble or fail, we must always keep going. Have a lovely evening. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, but also find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Pan Free to Air, and Star Times.